Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this series where we are discussing the book by Bernard Lievegoed called Phases of Childhood Growing in Body, Soul, and Spirit. We are up to chapter 3, but if you'd like to see the video on the introduction and chapter 1 and 2, it is linked in the description box below. And when I am referring to pages in this book, please note that this is the 1997 edition, but in the description box below, the latest edition is linked. So now we're going to focus on the first 7 years. That is the focus of this chapter. Previously, we saw an overarching theme between 0 and 21 years. And at this time, I'm going to do a very small recap of the phases of development as it pertains to 0 to 7, because there is some spiraling going from each 7-year cycle where you can see some patterns that are revisited with every cycle. So the first thing to take note is the terminology, and some of the terminology is fairly specific to the Waldorf pedagogy, and that is the direction of this book. However, when it comes to child development, a lot of this is observable natural phenomena, and so maybe terminology will be different depending on the child psychologist. So just note that when we're looking at the first 7 years and calling them the willing stage of development, it means that children are predominantly learning through imitation and through doing. Their will forces predominate at this stage of development. In the next 7 years, between 7 and 14, the child's feeling forces dominate, and between 14 and 21, the thinking forces dominate. With each of these 7-year cycles, there is a birth. Now, this is something that's pretty unique in terminology to the Waldorf pedagogy, but you can find it in other places, and it is an ancient concept. But at birth, the child experiences a physical birth. But there are other bodies that have yet to be quote unquote born. And with each of these 7-year cycles, a different body is born. But before it's born, it does do work on the body. And so in the first 7 years of life, the etheric forces or life forces are very strong in building the baby and child's body up until about age 7. At age 7, the etheric forces are freed to do other work, namely the academic work of the elementary age student. And then at 14, the astral body is born. And then at 21, the ego is born. So with these 7-year cycles, you have different bodies working on the child as the child develops. But within each of these 7-year cycles, you also have 2 developmental milestones called Rubicons that come at about 2 1/3 years, dividing each of these 7-year cycles into 3 phases. Now, birth to 7 is the willing phase. Willing comes first. And within these 7-year cycles, that first 2 1/3 year phase is the willing phase of development. The next 2 1/3 years is the feeling phase of the willing stage of development. And that final 2 1/3 years is the thinking phase of the willing stage of development. During this time, you also have a thinking development between 0 and 2 1/3 years, a feeling development between 2 and 1/3 years, and 4 and 2/3 years, and a will development between 4 and 2/3 years and 7 years. The loss of teeth, even though this is a period of time, but the loss of teeth mark the end of this first 7-year cycle. Now, since the loss of teeth occurs over a period of time, by the time children are 7 or in their 7th year, nearly all of them have lost at least 1 tooth. Now, if they haven't, then they're still within reason if it comes 6 months to a year or so, because these numbers are not hard and fast numbers. These are developmental stages, and each child develops uniquely. But we do want to pay attention to these developmental milestones to make sure that children are developing appropriately. Now, some of the very first milestones of development are movement, so sitting, crawling, standing, speech, and thinking. And one thing that the book distinguishes that humans have that animals don't is the ability to have laughter. And that is one of the things that really is a cornerstone of the human being, according to this author, Bernard Lievegoed, and the book Phases of Childhood, which is my primary resource, even though I do have other resources as well. The other resources are listed on the blog post that accompanies this video, and you can find that link in the description box below. So let's begin with the first 7 years. In the first 7 years, we have a willing stage, a feeling willing stage, and a thinking willing stage. And in that first 2 1/3 years, a lot is going on. The baby is going through a thinking development. So the brain, the head, the mind is going through so much development at that time as the baby has entered this world and is absorbing the world completely without any filter, and is as if it is one big sense organ. Mastery is one of the first priorities for the baby. The very first thing a child or a baby is doing once they are born is trying to gain control over their body. You might see this with a little infant who is trying to raise their head or move their arms, and it takes a little bit of time before the baby realizes or has that the ability to control their arms and eventually their legs and their head, of course. It takes about 6 weeks before the baby can control their arms, and one of the first things they do is put those hands in their mouth. Their mouth is a very big sense organ, and I would argue that it's even more sensitive than your fingertips. So as adults, we usually use our fingers and of course our other senses, but when it comes to touch, we are usually using our hands to feel, not usually our mouth and our tongues. But the baby is using their mouth as a way to experience the world, not just in taste, but in texture as well. How exciting is it for that 6-week-old baby to finally have control over their limbs, and now they have a plaything to keep them occupied. Now it takes a while before that little infant has this awakening in their eyes, and every parent knows that moment that comes at around 3 months where you just see this spark of awareness in their eyes and they go from infants to babies. There's a lot of development that's happening in the first 3 months of a baby's life, and a lot of doctors and psychologists say that in reality the baby should still be in utero for those 3 months, but if the baby stayed in the womb for those additional 3 months to really fulfill the development that's necessary for the baby's head would be too large to deliver. So those first 3 months, it's almost as though the baby is still womb-like. There's a lot of milestones within the first couple of years of life, probably more so than at any other time because so much development is happening. At 9 months, there's another really big developmental milestone where the baby's right and left hemisphere begins communicating. This is a time where a lot of babies have started to learn to crawl and are probably starting to pull themselves up and are attempting to stand and maybe walk by holding the couch, and they're definitely liking to crawl up the stairs if possible, and walking is just around the corner for them. Walking upright is a unique feature of human beings. No other mammal just walks on their 2 legs. Now you can see some mammals who may be on their hind legs and may be able to use their arms for other tasks, but their spines indicate that they are horizontal creatures by nature. So only the human being has a spine curvature that is uniquely upright. The upright orientation is not just for the ability to walk and have our arms free, which isn't just for our upright orientation, but actually has some interesting spiritual ramifications as well. But for the child to be upright, that particular orientation and perspective helps with their view of the world, and ultimately it does shape the way they think. However, talking and language shape the way the child thinks even more, and we're going to discuss that. But let's consider the limbs. The two legs are used to support our human body and for movement, yet our arms are not needed for movement or for support. And this is a curious thing from a spiritual perspective, or from a religious perspective, or from a philosophical perspective. Whichever perspective you adhere to, you'll find that it's a curious thing to have our arms free. According to the Waldorf pedagogy, your limbs, or your arms rather, are free in order to do good work, in order to give back to others, for charitable endeavors. And this is unique for the human being. So the child or the baby, as it's getting upright and acquiring a few words, is now moving into this toddler phase of development. Now, toddlerhood, or the terrible twos, is usually thought to be about a year, between 2 and 3, but any parent will tell you in reality it's more like 2 years, from about 18 months to 3.5 years. But in that time, a lot of, probably the most important developmental milestone is occurring at around 2 1/3 years. So let's look at the first 2 1/3 years before we hit this really important milestone. In this time, with the thinking development, we're going to see that the baby's head to body ratio is 1 to 4. The baby's head is cutting new teeth anytime in that first year, and is going through its own development based on the thinking development, but also just based on the fact that the head is so big in comparison to the rest of the body. So we're seeing, even though there is growth in the rest of the body, the proportions indicate that the head is much larger to the rest of the body. However, the head will still continue to grow, but the proportions will become 1 to 5 in about toddlerhood, 1 to 6 right around school age, and eventually as a full-grown adult, who is 6 feet tall, we can expect that the head to body ratio is about 1 to 8. Whenever there is a physical change or physical growth, it is an indication that there is a psychological development happening. So in that first 2 1/3 years, that willing stage of development, during a thinking development, we can see that the head is the predominant feature for the baby. And there are a lot of indications in the child's head or features rather, that are going to change in proportion as the child gets older. The size of the forehead, the placement of the eyes in relation to the ears, and the development of a neck, and nose actually, because when an infant is very small, there's not much of a neck, and there isn't much of a nose as well. And we can just imagine that those baby features, especially starting at around 3 months, when the baby has rounded out a little bit, because those first 3 months, the baby is still putting on weight, sleeping a lot. Their sleeping to wake ratio is very high. They're mostly sleeping in those first 3 months. And of course, in all of babyhood and even into toddlerhood, there is a higher proportion of sleep to wakefulness. Something else that's curious is the doubling of weight. This happens about 4 times in a person's life, where their weight will double at 5 months, 2 years, 8 years, and 16 years. And 2, 8, and 16 happen to coincide with major Rubicon milestones of development. At around 2.5, the child or the baby develops the eye. This is the first developmental milestone that is probably the most profound of all of them, where the baby realizes that they are a separate person, separate from their primary caregiver. And instead of referring to themselves in the third person, they refer to themselves as I. And no one else can call you I. I is only used to describe yourself. At 8 to 9 years old, you have another important developmental milestone. We usually call this the 9-year change. And this is when children sort of awaken to the world. This is a time when the fantasy world and the world of reality finally separate. Up until then, a young child could not distinguish the pretend or the fantasy world from reality. Even if you ask them, like, this is not real, they might parrot back to you that they understand, but in reality, cognitively, they cannot separate between the two. At around 8 to 9 years old, this is also a time when time actually begins to speed up, or really, more appropriately, the child feels time. Up until then, they didn't really feel time. It was like the day just spread out in front of them for eternity. And I remember when I was young, maybe 8 years old, maybe 7 years old, I used to think that the school year was a year long and that summer vacation was a year long. It wasn't until after the 9-year change that I would go to school, and by the end of the day, the week, the month, or the year, I would think the year only just started, like it went by so fast. The other developmental milestone that is quite profound is at 16, and you can see this is the doubling of body weight, the doubling of the child in each of these particular phases. And at 16, you have this other incredible milestone, this awakening to the spiritual or awakening to God. It's a time when the adolescent is seeking God or seeking spiritual truth. You'll notice that these 3 in particular milestones at around 2, around 8 or 9, and around 16 also coincide with a feeling stage within, or feeling phase rather, within that stage of development. And when there is a feeling stage, or rather I should say a feeling phase within a stage of development, and that would be the middle 2 and a third years within each 7-year cycle. This is a time when the trunk or the rhythmic system, the heart, the lungs, are going through a change, a growth, a development. And that happens to be the time when these 3 really major developmental milestones are occurring. So let's take it back to around 2 and a third, when the child is first going through their growth spurt in their breath. So they are widening in the trunk area, and this is before a growth spurt in the limbs. So children will usually put on a little bit of weight in their trunk before they stretch out. Something that's important to note is that in a way, children are growing from the head down. The head tends to be larger in comparison to the body throughout the stages of development. So when they are young, you have 1 to 4, and as an adult, you have 1 to 8. So you can see that the rest of the body needs to grow in a way to catch up to the development of the head. Now, the head will still grow until it reaches its adult size sometime in adolescence, but it's the proportion to the rest of the body that is curious. Now, even though the trunk may widen, it can also lengthen as well, but that is a different growth spurt than the limbs itself. And when the growth spurt in the limbs is occurring, it is occurring in the lower half of each limb before the upper half. So the growth spurt would be in the lower part of the leg, so below the knee, before the upper part of the leg, and again with the lower part of the arm, so below the elbow, before the upper part of the arm. So you can imagine during a time of these growth spurts, which occur 2 to 3 times before full maturity, it can be a slightly disorienting time for the child as their limbs extend and they have to become accustomed to their bodies again. The final phase within the 7-year cycle occurs at around 4 2/3, and this is the beginning of a will development during the thinking phase of the willing stage of development. Before we dive into that, let's recap and look at the entire 7-year cycle, this first 7 years, as a willing phase of development and distinguish the difference between willing and drive. Now, when a child is about 0 to 2 or 0 to 3, they are predominantly just in motion. They don't seem to ever stop, and they barely tire from their motion. They are exploring, they're trying to climb and crawl and move, and they are learning to control their bodies, and they're learning in that first 7 years through imitation. So this will look like if you express to your child a smile or even a frown, or even you pretend to cry, the child will mimic back to you those same expressions. Now, it can be like a silly party trick to do that to your child, but it is an indication that they are absorbing the world around them and they are imitating. They are the great imitators. But how do we distinguish between this will force and an internal drive? They are connected because the action, the drive, and the will are all connected together, but different aspects will predominate at different times. And ultimately, as adults, we do want our will forces, our feeling forces, and our thinking forces to be in alignment on a conscious level. But the child between 0 and 7 is in alignment with their thinking, willing, and feeling on an unconscious level. The way that looks like is that if a child wants something, they will just go for, they'll try to grab it or they'll try to take it. And let's look at a toddler or even a baby. They will just immediately do it. Or if they, let's take a toddler who's like, say, 3, if they want something and they are told no, or rather they're just not able to get it, they may have a tantrum, or they may cry, or they may still try to take whatever that item is that they want, because their thinking and their feeling and their willing is all combined. They're not separated. So there's no internal thought process when the child wants something. So let's say there is a truck on the floor and your toddler wants it. They're not going to contemplate the truck. They're not going to contemplate that they want it. They're just going to move towards it. And if another child has that truck, well, then a conflict is going to occur. In those first couple of years of life, that movement is an attempt at mastery over the child's or the baby's body. They're unable to control their body yet. They might not even know that this body is theirs, and they don't even know the extremities of their own body. So when you hold a baby and just press on that baby, they begin to know the extremities of their own body, the boundaries of their own body, because up until then, and even until that first developmental stage where they develop the I, they really don't see themselves as separate from their primary caregiver. They are one person. Cognitively, there's no understanding that the mother is separate. And if a mother tells a young child, I'll be back in 5 minutes, or I'm just going to answer a phone call, they have no comprehension of that. Also because they have no comprehension of time, not until the 9-year change. And so that's really not developmentally appropriate to think that, oh, they're only crying for a minute or two, because for them it feels like an eternity, whereas the parent knows. But let's talk about those cries in the first couple of years of life. A baby has a limited amount of ways to communicate their needs when they are young. As their senses, their sense organs are developing and they are taking in the whole world, the sights, the sounds, the taste, everything, they do not have mastery yet over themselves, of course, over language. And so when they have needs, they cry, and that is their way of communicating. However, any parent will tell you that generally before a baby cries, they can see maybe some small movements or nuanced facial expressions that indicate that the baby is needing something. So if a child wakes up from a nap, they might not cry immediately. They might root around if they wanted to nurse, or they might move around and kind of fidget a little bit and make small sounds to try to get their needs met before they resort to crying. But crying is still a way to communicate what their needs are. Their movement also is part of their development in that first 2 and 1/3 years, where they are trying to master sitting up, crawling, standing, walking, and running comes a little bit later, but it's all part of this desire for uprightness and movement. And we don't even need to teach children and babies. They just have an internal drive. They have an internal drive to do these things. And if they are not meeting some of those milestones that other children are meeting, then it is important to look into that, because they are indicative of other developmental changes happening psychologically, internally. So we do want to pay attention to those developmental milestones and remember that children develop different from other children. And so it's important to know the window of when these developments should be reached. In some cases, you might have that same child who excels in say a movement development, like maybe they crawl early or they walk early, but then they learn their first word a little bit later. So there can even be those nuances as well. When we move into that second 2 and 1/3 years time block, we're looking at a feeling phase within a willing stage of development during a feeling development. So there's a double feeling right here during this willing phase. So you can imagine that the tantrums can get a little bit intense at this stage. And you can see that the cries are changing a little bit. The cries now are desires to get, not always, but in some cases, their wants met rather than their needs met. So prior to the development of the eye, those cries were primarily need-based, but they do shift into want-based. But this is completely normal and natural for the child. Then they have this next phase of development at around 4 2/3. During this time, there is a growth spurt in the limbs. So prior to that, there was a growth spurt in the trunk area. And while the child is still growing everywhere, and at the same time, they're losing their baby fat, you can see that as they're moving into this last 2 and 1/3 years of this first stage of development, you're going to see that the muscle structure begins to be apparent under the skin. Before that, they were just soft and rounded, and they had a very rounded figure. Babies had a very rounded figure before this last stage of development, where the spine develops that nice S curve, the limbs extend, the neck is developed, even the nose develops, the facial structure begins to look more childlike, and that child is moving into a childlike figure. In these first 7 years, the child goes through 3 really distinct physical changes that probably don't happen any other time. This many changes in this short period of time, any other time in the person's life. Puberty, of course, is a huge developmental milestone where you can see a lot of physical changes, but within 7 years, you're going from an infant to a toddler to a childlike body. During this will development, in this thinking phase, you have the growth spurt of the limbs, and you have, at first, maybe there's a little bit of discoordination, but then you have the child stepping into themselves with a little bit more surety and more resolution in their movement. And this is a really beautiful physical manifestation of an internal development. During that time, you also have a thinking phase. So this is the time when children at around the age of 5 are first stepping out into nursery school, preschool, kindergarten. It's their first exposure from the home life to this community life. Now, granted, some children will have entered some kind of preschool before that, but what's curious about around 5 years old is that it coincides with a developmental milestone that makes going to kindergarten or preschool especially favorable for the child. When the child was a little bit younger, you may notice that even though children look like they were playing together, a lot of times they were playing in parallel. They might both be playing with similar toys, maybe side by side. They may trade toys or want each other's toys, but there wasn't a shared imaginative experience unless there was an older child or parent present directing that kind of play. On their own, they weren't developmentally able to engage in that kind of imaginative play. A lot of the play that they would have before this developmental milestone would be play that resembled real life experiences. So if the parent was sweeping the floor, the child might imitate that task and want to sweep the floor with either a full-size broom or a little child-sized broom. In fact, children that age love to do what their parents are doing, and whenever possible, having their own set of tools or a broom and a vacuum or even like a little doll stroller. Children really love to participate in the activities that the adults around them are participating in. When they move into this next phase of development at around 5, children now are engaged in shared imaginative play with their peers. Now, this is a time when stories get more creative. The stories that are told to children as well have more tension and maybe greater imaginative qualities versus the stories that a 4-year-old would enjoy, which are more narrative and descriptive of their day. So a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old may like a bedtime story where the parent is telling them about what they did during the day, and they had breakfast, and then they went to the park, and then they had lunch, and then they took a nap, and they like those kinds of stories. Once the child is about 5 or 6, they want stories that have a little bit more interest and tension, and those are the stories that they really enjoy. Their shared imaginative experiences can last for hours, and they can get very intense and descriptive, and they don't need a lot for this kind of imaginative play. Oftentimes, their imagination fills in what isn't there, and in fact, it's probably better to have things that are less defined so that the child can fill in with his or her own imagination. So simple fabric and blocks and materials that a child can reuse in different ways to make a doll or a sword or fabric for a house or a garment. If it's simple, it could be anything. But if your dress-up clothes are specific, then it's going to limit the child to think of just things that you can use, say, with a firefighter outfit versus just some red cloth or green cloth, which could be anything. So we want to keep the materials, the toys that a child is going to use as open-ended as possible at that stage so that they can fill in with their own imagination the type of material that they imagine that item to be. Now let's look at the 3 major developmental milestones that a child from 0 to 7 needs to accomplish, and that is walking, talking, and thinking. We're going to focus on how a child goes from being a newborn to being able to talk, walk, and think. The first thing is that the child first needs to collect information. Now, there's no filter at this time because there's no defined self. The self is still emerging. And so everything in the world is coming directly into the baby, and the baby needs to process all of the information that is coming in through the senses while simultaneously learning language while trying to gain mastery and control over their own body. So I want to read you a quote from the book by Bernard Lievegoed. It's on page 52 and 53 of the 1997 edition, and it says, "The surrender to the world takes place with a force which at a later age can only be compared with the complete surrender of a religious person." It's a really important part to recognize that taking in all of this sense perception, the taking in everything through their sense organs is like the surrender of a religious person, because so much is going on. We as adults are able to protect ourselves and assimilate slowly from the world because we have a well-established I, and there is a balance between what goes out into the world and what comes in to ourselves. This is a development of the adult that the child, the baby, doesn't have yet, in part because they are just taking everything in, and in part because they don't have a well-established I yet. The element directed to the divine being in religion is active at the physical level in the child. This age can be described as a religious surrender to the environment, and it's called a physical religion. So before the child has even mastered walking or talking or thinking and being upright, they are absorbing all of this information from the world around them. Now, they can't quite process it. They can't even choose what to assimilate. They are just bringing everything in, and it is equivalent, as the author says, to a religious surrender. Because the child or the baby is completely taking in everything from their surroundings, it's especially important that we work on our inner development throughout our entire journey of being a parent, but especially in those first few years. On page 54, children whose soul is completely open to the world and not only perceive their father's actions when he turns away in irritation, walks out the door, but also assimilates the moral content of such gestures, these remain in the depths of their subconscious. It means that that baby is absorbing everything. If you're stressed, the baby can feel it. If you're upset, angry, happy, the baby can feel it. And if we say, "No, I'm fine," when you're not, then that's a big confusion for the baby, because they can sense those feelings, they have just that intuition to be able to see the truth behind your actions. And so if we are being dishonest by saying, "No, I'm fine," or "I'm not upset," when you're clearly upset, that's even of greater confusion for the child. But regardless, they're going to absorb that. Whether you try to turn away and not expose that to the child, they're going to feel it and absorb it, and it's going to go into their subconscious. Now, sometimes we think, well, they're just babies, they're not going to remember. And while that is partly true, they might not remember, but their subconscious does, and it will emerge later, especially those moral lessons. So those moral lessons do need to come early, which means that your character is of paramount importance even when your children are just babies. So let's move into toddlerhood and the immersion of language and how that impacts thinking. Now, the small child is a creature of imitation. While they are imitating the people around them, they are also absorbing everything on an unconscious level. Now, the things that they absorb unconsciously, and actually the more they are unconscious of their surroundings, the more, or rather the less they perceive consciously, the more it will become part of their subconscious, and the more it will lay the foundation for future conscious experiences. Now, if this sounds a little bit alarming, it should be. It means that nothing gets past those little babies, toddlers, and children. They actually see things more truthfully than any other person, child or adult, because they are so young and they are just absorbing completely around them, and they don't use their cognitive abilities to filter what they are experiencing. So once again, it is really important that we're doing our inner work and our inner development, because our children are going to be imitating us at this time between 0 and 7. They're going to imitate us in other ways as they get older, but it is in these first 7 years that they're especially going to imitate us, especially on the physical level. So they will literally mimic us either in their vocabulary, and a lot of parents report not realizing the vocabulary that they used around their children, because then their children are repeating after them without understanding the gravity of the words they're using. And of course, on a physical level, they're literally imitating with their bodies. They're doing the action that they see that the parents or the adults doing. Developmentally, it's also important to remember that a baby's trust to the world is established in the first few years of life. It's directly related to how quickly or how effectively a baby's needs are attended to, and this allows them to feel trust in the world around them. Now, I'm not of the opinion that if something happens when a child is young, it's nothing can be done about it and it can't be solved or healed in the future. There's always something that you can do in order to recover from any of these shortcomings that a child might have experienced in their developing years. However, it is important to note that according to the Waldorf pedagogy, they do hold the idea of reincarnation. And I do want to clarify that while this is common in the Waldorf pedagogy or amongst anthroposophists, which is the spiritual science that Waldorf education is based on, I would just want for clarity to explain that those ideas do not align with our religious ideas. So we do not believe in reincarnation. However, understanding that reincarnation is an aspect of Waldorf education, or I should say, based on the spiritual science that does believe in reincarnation, that when there are maybe not the ideal situation in childhood, it can result in either a medical condition in adulthood, or if there's a medical condition for a child in this life, it could be an indication of something in a previous life, or if things didn't work out so great in this life because of different circumstances and situations, that how should I say this? It's okay because there are other chances in the future. I just want to say that while Waldorf educators may differ on how they interpret this understanding, regardless, as a religious person, I do not hold these beliefs. But I do think that when we have difficult situations in babyhood, toddlerhood, childhood that were not ideal, we can still recover from them when we are older. And there is a way to renegotiate those circumstances. So if you're looking back on your parenting or your own childhood and you have these areas where they weren't ideal, or maybe trust wasn't established in those first few years of life, that's okay. We can always renegotiate those in later life. Now that the child is walking, it awakens the first of 3 kinds of memories. And this first memory is environmental memory. This is the memory associated to, let's say you are revisiting your old childhood home, and when you go into the yard or down the street that you used to live on, or you see the park at the end of the road, it sparks memories from when you were a child living in that home. The next memory is a rhythmic memory, and it usually peaks at around 3 or 4 years of age, and it's active until about the 9-year change. Rhythmic memory is not tiring. Actually, anything that's rhythmic is not tiring for the child or for the adult. Imagine just walking as, things that you do in rhythm. So walking versus, say, a sport. One can be sustained much longer than the other. Or even running. Running is another one, especially long distance or ultra marathon running is something that can be sustained over, say, doing a sport for that same duration. So rhythmic activities are not tiring to the body the way other activities are. And so at around 3 or 4, where rhythmic memory peaks, you can see the very easy acquisition of lullabies and songs and even stories where the child might want that same story told over and over and over again. And it's usually not enjoyable for an adult to tell a story over and over again, exactly the same. But actually for the child, they really enjoy it. And if you say anything that's different or you miss an aspect of the story, they're going to remember it. And the final type of memory is abstract memory, and that begins after the 9-year change, but really emerges after puberty, where abstract thought is developing. And that kind of memory, we want to avoid having that kind of tax on a child when they're younger, because abstract memory is difficult for a child versus, say, rhythmic memory. And we want to keep things within the imagination for the child and not in the abstract until post-puberty or until the high school years, the adolescent years. Let's look at talking, especially as it relates to brain development. In general, the first sounds a baby will make are the vowel sounds like ah. Then the first consonant sounds tend to be whining sounds like m or n for mothers, and b, p, and d for fathers. Now, this particular statement isn't from the book, but I learned it from a parenting conference many decades ago. And there's some wisdom behind associating certain sounds with certain caregivers. Usually a mother is there to meet the child's needs, while a father or a father figure is there to bring excitement and risk to the baby or to the child. In general, a mother figure is there consistently, and a father figure is there inconsistently, bringing excitement when the father or father figure appears. Now, these are figures. It's not that it has to be a mother or a father in particular. It could be a grandfather or grandmother. But in general, you have mama or nana for mother figures or figures who meet the child's needs. And then you have things like baba, papa, or dada, or daddy, or dad for the father figure. And the popping sound is exciting, and the m or n sound is more whining. And those two distinctions are associated to the types of caregivers that that child has. And so in general, you'll find universally these different sounds associated to these kinds of caregivers. Now, there can be some differences, but this is a generalization for language development. Something that's really curious is that the part of the brain that is responsible for language development is also associated to the hand. We can imagine that the hand is what grasps the world. And what's even more curious is that in right-handed children, the language is related to the right hand in the brain. The part of the brain where language develops is also associated to the right hand in a right-handed child and to the left hand in a left-handed child. As it relates to language, I want to quote for you this sentence on page 58. Language is the collective spiritual heritage of a group of people who feel more closely related by this than anything else. And this indicates another level to the importance of language development, that it's not just for communication, but it also contains a spiritual significance as well. Now, language does relate to brain development, and linked in the description box below are two videos. One is by the psychologist Lara Borodetsky, and it is a TED Talk on the differences in languages and how it affects your thoughts or your perceptions of these particular items, and how it's different between different languages. It's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to language development. In the book, it relates to languages which use fewer words in order to encapsulate an image versus other languages that require more words in order to convey the same message. And in each language, you have a thought process associated to that type of language, whether you can say fewer words and still have the message, or whether you need more descriptive words in order to convey the same message. This is very curious. There are some languages that have an abundance of words for certain things, like the Inuit, who have many words to describe snow, probably more words to describe snow than other languages. And this indicates this particular nuance to understanding something from the environment that is unique for that location. There are other languages that have other or more extensive vocabulary for other words, but also there are some languages that have the capacity to have millions of words, whereas other languages don't even have a million words because of the root system and how it is in some ways has that ability to grow with people, or grow with new experiences or new developments in technology, etc., because of the flexibility of the language. In all cases, knowing another language does help with brain development and gives you a new perspective. It's probably one of the most profound things that you can do to help cultivate a new way of thinking, and that's just acquiring another language. So if you have the option or the opportunity to learn another language, I highly recommend that you do. The thinking associated to that language is going to be different than than other languages. In the Waldorf pedagogy, in languages, it is the vowels that convey feelings, reverence, awe, even antipathy. These are the vowels, and then the consonants are the sounds that build these words, and the nouns are, in essence, a shortcut to understanding the true essence or quality of a thing. The true quality and essence of something is not a single word, it's an understanding. And yet we use words to convey, or rather to give you a shortcut so that you can convey these ideas. When a child is acquiring language, let's say they're learning the word tree, they are learning what a tree is so that they can identify any tree, or maybe most trees, but they won't know that specific species of tree, for instance. So when they're learning about a tree, they're understanding the concept of what a tree is without having to understand that a tree is composed of branches and a trunk and leaves. They understand the whole picture first before they understand the parts, which means that they can generally call like any car a car, or most houses they'll call it a house, because they're understanding the concept rather than the individual pieces that make up that. So when we learn more nuanced language, we can say, whether it's a car or a pickup truck or an SUV or a sedan or a race car, we understand those nuances in the language, but the child understands the whole concept of a car or a house or a plane or a tree, rather than those individual components. To conclude this section on talking and thinking, I'm going to read you a quote from page 62. The child's environment at the time of learning to speak is of great importance for the development of character. During the first years of life, it was the spirit of morality which had the greatest influence on the child, but now it is the way language is spoken around the child. We have to remember that moral instruction occurs from the time of birth, not just in our own character, but in the language that we speak. Let's finish up with looking at play, one of the quintessential activities of childhood and its importance. Children's play is their work. They have to play. This is how they process their environment, and it is part of their thinking, which is associated to their willing and feeling. We know that children develop the ability to have shared imaginative experiences at around 5 years old. If your child has shared imaginative experiences before then, it's likely been introduced by a parent or an older child. If all the children want to play house together and they assign one person to be the mother and one person to be the father, they might assign that little child to be the baby. And so they're participating in this shared imaginative experience, but they are not initiating it on their own. Now, children's play is their work. We have to remember that they need the space and the time to do their play. They're not quite ready for academic work, but they are certainly ready for stories and to reimagine their experiences in the form of play. Now, when it comes to stories, fairy tales are often used, especially in grade 1, and there is significance to fairy tales being used as an instructional tool, but you can use other stories as well. The importance of using fairy tales in particular is that it delivers grand truths, right and wrong, great spiritual truths through these stories that are easily digested by children. If we were to talk about these great truths otherwise, we would be meeting the child through a developmental capacity that they are not ready for. But by introducing these stories at this age, they actually absorb these spiritual truths in a way that makes sense to them, and probably in a way that as adults, we may not be able to assimilate them because of the fantastical or imaginative qualities of the story. On page 71, I want to read you one last quote on fairy tales so that we have a clear understanding of why fairy tales are used and what their capacity for education is. Fairy tales also originated in this creative imagination during the stage when men still lived within such forces. The fairy tales, which are true folk tales, are always concerned with great truths of life and death, good and evil, the growth of the soul and humanity, and its strength and chivalry. The content is formed by profound truth coming from the world of the still semi-conscious creative spirit. The form is that of the childish creative fantasy. It's important to also understand that fairy tales have a deeper spiritual meaning than what we are just reading on the page. And it's usually something that children can subconsciously absorb, and generally adults don't quite see it the same way. So for instance, when we are reading a fairy tale about Little Red Riding Hood, for instance, and the wolf swallows the grandmother whole, that can be really horrific when we are using our intellectual faculties to understand this fairy tale rather than the child understanding the fairy tale for probably what it more truthfully is. And those lessons are varied and quite deep, but grand truths about life and resurrection when the grandmother is able to come out of the wolf, and other spiritual truths that may or may not align with your particular religious beliefs. I wanted to share this aspect of the book because while many people may still use fairy tales, when we understand why they are used, then we may choose stories that have the same grand gestures but will reflect either religious or cultural stories that are significant for us and our family. I hope that you enjoyed this look at the years birth to age 7 and all of the milestones within this developmental stage. I do hope you'll check out the other videos in this series, as well as the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find the link to the blog post, as well as all of the links to the other materials and videos that I shared in this video in the description box below. And if you'd like to see what kind of books we're reading on a daily basis, I encourage you to check me out on my website at pepperandpine.com.